Deputy Boyd Barrett.
As you can see, I front-loaded a lot of my amendments to get this stuff in at the beginning.
Heartbeat experience.
Yeah, indeed. But, I mean, while I never really anticipated the Minister would take on board the wealth tax or our more far-reaching proposals on corporate tax, I do think this is one that really should be considered, right? And what our amendment here is looking to have a report on, although we would like to see it implemented, is to get rid of the tax on the family home and replace it with a tax on multiple properties. So this is making the distinction which the government, I think, willfully refuses to make when we're discussing with wealth, because they want to collapse the distinction between the family home and people who own 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 50, 100 properties. There's a world of difference between those two things. The family home, by and large, is not, for the people who live in it, an asset to generate wealth. It's a roof to put over your head when access to housing is, a concern for people, particularly when you're in the teeth of a housing crisis, but always has been in this country. There's a distinction between that and people who then rent out property and make profit from it. And this proposes a property tax that excludes the family home, but then imposes €1,000 tax on a second home, €1,500 if you have 3 to 10 homes, and a €2,500 tax if you have 10 homes or more per home. And that, when you consider the enormous rents that are being charged, when you think about the inflation of property values that Deputy Nash has referred to, because that is part of the rise in household wealth, sure, although it's also financial, as I pointed to, but that concentration of wealth, where it's grown sort of exponentially, really, is particularly, it's real wealth when you're talking about people who have 2, 5, 10, 15, 20 homes. That's serious wealth. And that's people making money just by virtue of the fact that they own lots of property. And I think it would be, what we're proposing actually is a very modest measure. Remove the regressive burden on people who may have a low income and are paying property tax on the value of their principal private residence, and replace it with a tax that is on second homes or more than 2 homes, and on a sort of escalating basis depending on how much property you own. And according to our costings that we did based on the the ready reckoner that the department provides for doing costings and these things, that if we did that, it would raise the money to cover the lost revenue of the current property tax which is levied on the family home.
Minister.
Thank you. Amendment number 5 would require the Minister for Finance to prepare and lay a report within 3 months of the passing of the Finance Bill on the revenue that would be raised by abolishing the local property tax and applying a graduated non-principal private residence tax, starting at €1,000 for a second home, rising to €2,500 for 11th and subsequent homes. Earlier this year, I implemented a significant reform of the local property tax that is now entering its final phase of being implemented. Since its introduction, the charging structure for local property tax has included a higher rate for properties valued above €1 million, and the revised system continues to apply a higher rate at above €1.05 million and a third rate to properties valued above €1.75 million. This approach increases the progressivity of the tax by increasing the effective rate on the highest value homes. This is a tax that has yielded €3.6 billion since its introduction in 2013. Revenue publishes statistics relating to local property tax on a regular basis, and I note that the annual statistic report includes information in respect of ownership of multiple properties. For instance, in 2020, this report indicated that there were around 177,000 property owners with 2 or more properties, covering 559,000 properties. Using these published revenue figures and applying the rates of tax in the amendment, the estimated yield would be approximately €700 million from the measures proposed here. This compares to the estimated LPT yield in 2022 of approximately €530 million.
There you go. We're making you some money, Minister.
It is important to note, however, that these estimates are based on the current LPT register of properties, and so a lot of the underlying data derives back to 2013. This means that it is likely that the position will change once 2022 returns are filed, as revaluation updates and extensions to the register will all provide new valuations data. It must be noted that a charge levied on second and subsequent homes would be levied at high rates in order to generate significant income to replace the revenue from LPT. However, it has to be borne in mind that in all likelihood, landlords faced with the prospect of such increased charges would pass on the resulting costs to tenants. This would aggravate an already difficult housing situation, particularly in large urban centres. And as the committee will be aware, we've seen recent market commentary from daft.ie that rents have risen by an average of 2.6% in the third quarter of 2021 nationwide, and that across the country as a whole, market rents are now nearly 7% higher than a year ago. LPT is an effective and important, stable and sustainable source of revenue for the local government sector. All property owners who benefit from essential local services help to fund those services through the local property tax. And for those reasons outlined, I don't propose to accept this amendment. Thank you, Cathaoirleach.
Thank you, Minister. Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Well, first of all, that's an interesting admission, Minister, that if we imposed this tax on people who own multiple properties, that they might pass it on to tenants, because what you're actually admitting there is that your rent control measures are going to be completely ineffective. And as it happens, I agree with you. But that's what you're effectively admitting, because we have the government trumpeting that it's going to limit rent increases to 2% or inflation, depending on which is the lower. So if your proposals in that regard were going to be effective, which I don't believe they will be as it happens, but then that wouldn't be an issue. And certainly in the world that we would want to construct around the rental sector, we would introduce rent controls where that couldn't happen, right? So they wouldn't be able to pass on the cost, and that we would actually reset rents at affordable levels through some sort of rent authority that would set rents at affordable levels. So that particular criticism doesn't concern us, because we think you can and should control rents given the extortionate cost of rents and the contribution they're making to the current housing crisis. But thank you for giving the full costing on our proposal, because what it demonstrates is, yeah, we could raise more than the current local property tax, approximately 150 million more by doing this. So we could remove, people need to know this, we could remove the property tax on the family home and replace it with a tax on those who own multiple properties and generate more revenue and have a fairer situation. And I think that is preferable. And people should know that the numbers of people who own multiple properties. 125,000 people in this country have 2 properties. 50,000 have 3 to 10, and 3,000 people have more than 10. And that's real wealth. And just to say, the person who owns a second property isn't necessarily stunningly wealthy, but it is wealth beyond the principal private residence. Actually, they wouldn't end up paying a lot more in our situation because they wouldn't be paying on their principal residence, but they would be paying 1,000 on that second property. But that's, you know, that's not punitive, but I think it's fairer. And then if you had 3 properties, up to 10, you'd be paying 1,500 on each property. And if you have more than 10, you'd be paying 2,500 on each property. And if you have more than 10, come on, you're seriously property rich. And you're generating a lot of revenue from the property you own. So it's quite a modest proposal, but it would raise more than you're able to raise with a tax that I certainly believe, and I think many people believe, is unfair. So that's the logic, but I know the Minister doesn't agree, so.
Anyone else we should speak? Minister, do you have anything further to add?
We would end up in a situation where you have less properties paying more tax, which is the very kind of concentration risk that we get warned about all the time. We are continually advised that you're better to be in a situation that you have more taxpayers, more tax units, all making a contribution. And yet again, what Deputy Boyd Barrett and Deputy O'Farrell are proposing is a narrowing of our tax base. And in the circumstances in which you are proposing this tax, I think there are 2 things that could happen. Well, there are 3 things that could happen. The first thing that could happen is the property owner will just pay the higher rate of tax on the non-family home that you're referring to, and they could pay that. The second thing that could happen is they could pass as much of that as they can on until they hit the cap in rent increases that the government has in place. The third thing that could happen, Deputy, is they could decide that owning multiple properties is not worth the additional cost and end up in the situation then when they exit the private rental sector. Now, I don't want those other 2 things to happen. We are in a situation at the moment, I think, where in the huge challenge that we have with our rental market at the moment, many are advocating policies at the moment that would end up reducing the supply of rental properties. And I don't want to put in place measures that add to the number of landlords that may decide they don't want to provide rental accommodation anymore, thereby making things even worse for tenants. But leaving those arguments aside for a moment, I'd make the point to you that this is exactly the same as what you have proposed in looking to get rid of a large chunk of the universal social charge. You'll narrow the base, which is exactly the kind of thing that we were all warned against doing in the aftermath of the crisis a decade ago. That's what your measures will do. That's what the measure of Deputy O'Farrell will do too.
Amendment being pressed?
Yes.
Pressing the amendment. So the question is then that on amendment number 5, the question is that a new section be there inserted. Those in favour say Tá. And those against say Neil.
Neil.
Neil. I think the question is lost.